Greetings, Ohio Valley. This is Dan Lima with OSU Extension from Belmont County.
And this is Karen Cox from WVU Extension in Ohio County. Thanks for tuning in to Extension Calling, your source for research-based information for the farm, garden, and home. Good morning, Dan.
Good morning, Karen.
All right, we are back again, and we are still enjoying the glorious ups and downs of March.
That's right. We're almost to mid-March, and the possibilities are endless.
Right. And, one of the things a lot of people are talking about now is they're trying to get their Arbor Day and Earth Day programs set up. So, a lot of schools and volunteer organizations want to do tree plantings for Arbor Day, which is absolutely fantastic. And so, one of the most frequent things that we get asked is, well, besides, do you have any free trees? But, but it is, how do you plant a tree properly?
That's right. And that's something that it's very overlooked. And let's just say you did get the free tree, right? You put all this effort into getting the soil ready, digging the hole, prepping the plant, putting it in there, watching it, watering it. Whether you pay for it or not, proper planting is really going to be what will set you up for success and make it all worthwhile. Because, what's the point of even a free tree if you can't plant it properly and have it grow healthy?
Right. And there are some super adventurous people out there that want to start a tree from seed, which is awesome and I highly recommend it. But you do have to recognize, especially with some trees, that the seed is not going to, especially for fruit trees, may not give you the same fruit definitely will not give you the same apple that you got that seed out of, because there is sexual propagation and asexual propagation. And whenever we are duplicating our apple tree so that we have the same exact apple, that uses a clonal cutting. So you just cut a stem off and graft that to a rootstock. If you were to start that same apple seed from scratch, you'll probably get more characteristics of the tree that pollinated that tree. So either a crab apple or another apple tree that's nearby. Sometimes you may luck out and it's totally edible. Other times it may be awful and sour and tiny. So you do have to know what kind of tree is going to give you a good seed that's going to be representative. And usually, if you're collecting trees from the wild, your acorns, your honey locusts, or black walnuts, those are going to be probably pretty true to the parent tree. But you do need to note that, just like some flowers, some of those tree seeds are going to need to go through a process of chilling.
That's right. Yeah. What we typically say is for a nut type tree, you're going to need to stratify or chilling, as Karen was saying. And that is, it's a cold period that will set the seed up for germination. It's usually between 90 and 100 days of refrigerated temperatures. So, if you do want to try that, basically you're collecting the seed in the fall. You are putting it in a little baggie, put the seed in a sawdust mixture, a little bit of water in there, not enough to grow mold, just enough to keep the seed from drying. Because if the seed dries too much, then it's not going to be any good and it won't stratify correctly. But a little bit of moisture, some sawdust, seal it in a Ziploc bag so that moisture is in there, and put it in the refrigerator. You don't want to freeze it. The freezer is way too low in temperature.
Mm-hmm.
Like a freezer is not just at 32, but it's a very cold temperature. And if you try to stratify under a freezer conditions, you'll probably ruin the seed. But refrigeration is good enough. So around 40 degrees Fahrenheit. And then just keep it in there in a nice Ziploc bag with a little bit of moisture and some sawdust from 90 to 100 days. So the duration of winter. I know it's a little late for that now, but it's something to think about.
Now, for some trees, you don't need as much stratification, and you do need to find out if the tree requires stratification at all. If you're trying to propagate a fir tree, for example, you only need to stratify it for about 30 days. But there's a great chart to know how many days your particular tree needs to be stratified. It's called Growing Tree Seedlings from Seed. It's by Iowa State University Extension on their natural resource stewardship page. And it's a great one. It has a lot of your basic information of how to collect the seeds. If you need to heat, like say if you're doing conifers that are heat sensitive, that are fire species, what we call, and they need that heat for the cone to open, gives you some instructions on that. And it's a really good resource. Again, it is Growing Tree Seedlings from Seed from Iowa State University Extension and Outreach.
Yeah.
And they do have a great chart for how many stratification days are required. And if you don't want to stratify, nature doesn't, put anything in the refrigerator. What happens in nature is that it just kind of sits out over the winter. And so it also tells you a little bit of information if you're not going to stratify when you're going to plant that seed. So, for instance, if you have your soft maples, which are your red maples, your silver maples, things like that, whereas your sugar maple is considered a hard maple. Those are your soft maples you're going to plant in the spring. When all those helicopters are flying March through May, you're going to be collecting them, and then you can just go ahead and stick those in the ground. But when you're looking at your fall bearing fruits, then if you don't want to stratify them, just plant them in the fall in your seedling bed and wait. Wait over the winter.
Yeah.
Of course, you got pests outside, right?
Mhm.
You've got your nut weevils and all those little critters that want to eat what you're trying to sprout. So you have to have a way to protect your seeds, and putting them in some nice fluffy sawdust in your refrigerator is a great way to protect them from all those predators that are out there looking to chow down.
Yeah, and it's not just those insects because I think as far as like nuts go or seeds that are considered nuts, so larger seeds, the squirrels, they just love them.
Squirrels and chipmunks, man. Mm.
And they will dig them up, eat them, or just dig them up and throw them out. They, it's like it's complete sabotage.
They'll take 2 bites and pitch it.
That is going to be your worst enemy right there.
Yeah.
It's not so much those weevils, it's those squirrels
Yep, yep.
and chipmunks and the whole gang.
Right. So, once you get your seed ready, and you're ready for to put them out and get them sprouting, you want to make sure that they have enough space to grow. But when you're looking at your tree species, you really want to consider how deep that initial taproot is. So, when you're putting it into a pot, you can't put it into just a normal starter pack, right? Because that's going to give you a really, really shallow root system. And when you're looking at a tree, the first root that's going to grow is that big tap root. And that root is designed to get that tree access to a lot of water and to give it a basis from which to start. And so as the tree gets older, it isn't going to be as important or even as large comparatively to the other roots. But when they're young, that taproot is really critical. And if you put it in a pot that's too shallow, a lot of times what happens is it'll hit the bottom of the pot and it's going to turn and it's going to curve upwards into the shape of a J. And this is what we call a J root. And what happens then is that root is no longer going down. Instead, it's growing upwards, and then those roots start growing all weird and will actually start to strangle the tree. And it's not going to have a good structural support. It's not going to be able to access nutrients that it needs or get enough water. So, this is really critical if you're going to be starting a tree from seed, that you give it a nice deep pot of soil.
Yeah, and just a little bit more on that. Anytime you have a plant that has root issues, you have to understand that there's regulation on both the top and the bottom of the plant. So if you are inhibiting the roots from growing, the roots will actually send a signal to the shoot up to the leaves, and it'll keep the growth up there smaller than it would normally. So there's like this communication that goes on between the top of the plant and the bottom of the plant. And if one's inhibited, whether it's compacted soil, poor nutrients, sometimes it's just the genetics, sometimes it's root pruning. And you can see that there's an art form, bonsais, where they actually trim the roots for that purpose. But in this case, you don't want to.
Mhm.
And you have that J root, it's causing root issues. And it's going to cause a lot of problems in the shoot, and you're not going to get a very well developed tree. You're not going to get it to the size you want. It's probably going to grow a little funkier than you would like, so it won't maintain its shape as well. So it is very important to make sure that that root is planted correctly at the proper depth. Root health is pivotal to plant growth.
Right. And, when you're thinking about from the perspective of a nursery, a tree nursery, if you are not starting your own seeds and you are purchasing your seedlings from outside, checking out those roots is going to be critical. If you're starting a Christmas tree nursery or a fruit tree nursery or a shade tree nursery, and you're going to, let's say you want to focus on our native species, and you're going to be trying to propagate, or not propagate, but just to build out the availability. That's a fantastic idea. But if you are getting your seedlings from outside, really look at those roots before you stick them in the ground in your nursery. Because if you already have malformed roots at the seedling stage, they're not going to grow out of it. Now, you can prune off that J root, but if there's not enough other roots to support, like if it's too high up in that root system where it starts to curve, you'd be better off just getting rid of that seedling and getting a different one. Because if you have to prune off so much of the root that it doesn't have enough feeder roots to keep it alive, then you're going to be suffering overall on the health of your tree. Like Dan was saying, it's going to mimic up top what you've done down below. So if you have cut off the entire taproot of a young tree and you're just hoping that those five lateral roots are going to be able to support it, you may find that you have a stunted tree that's not healthy throughout its life. It's more susceptible to diseases, et cetera, et cetera. It may be easier to be wind thrown, which means that if a strong wind hits it, it falls over. And nobody, especially not in an urban or suburban environment, wants that. So it's really important to watch the roots from start to finish.
So let me walk through the process here. So I'm a customer, I would like to plant a tree of sorts. So I go to the nursery, I see all the trees in those pots. I guess some red flags that I would advise people in that situation would be, you see like a 1 gallon pot, but you see a tree that has a 2-inch trunk on it, right? Trees that, so and Karen, I'd like your input on this, but one of the red flags I tell people is you don't want to buy a plant that has outgrown its pot, because at that point, those issues that we talked about with root stunting and inability for the roots to grow the way they should have already happened typically, because this tree's just been in there way too long. So what are your thoughts on trees that seem to be way too big for the pot that they're contained in?
Well, there are regulations and guidelines for nurseries that in order to have a certain diameter stem, that you need to have a certain diameter root ball that goes with it.
But it's something that you might find. So just be wary. It's like we were talking about, an unhealthy plant will take longer to recoup and grow than having a smaller healthy plant. The shock in a plant will really slow it down a lot more, so you don't necessarily gain a lot of time.
Right. In fact, we actually have a rule of thumb that we use. If it is less than 2 inches in caliper, it will have much less transplant shock than if it's larger than 2 inches of caliper. So, and they have done studies where they have shown they took a 3 inch caliper tree and a 2 inch caliper tree and planted them in the same growing conditions. And after the first year, the 3 inch caliper tree, of course, was a little bit bigger. But after 5 years, the 2 inch caliper tree had caught up and surpassed the 3 inch caliper tree because it was less susceptible to that transplant shock.
And hey, Karen, do you mind talking about caliper?
Oh, yeah, yeah, yeah. So caliper is basically, so in forestry, we measure the diameter of the trunk. And so we have a tool that we use to wrap around the trunk and it calculates the diameter. And then we use that at 4.5 feet above the ground. But when you're looking at small trees in nursery settings, you're looking at caliper, which is the distance across. So it's still your diameter, but you're measuring at 6 inches above the soil line. So a 2-inch caliper tree is a much different size than a 2-inch diameter tree. Okay, so caliper again, it's you just take a ruler, lay it straight across the trunk from side to side where it crosses 6 inches above the soil line. That's the caliper of the tree.
And that's really different from the diameter.
Well, it's just measured differently. It's hard.
But it's gonna be close, right? Like
Right, right.
at least in a small tree, when we're talking about like saplings.
Right. It's the bigger the tree is, the harder it is to measure diameter with a straight stick, because of how your eye hits the side of the tree. And
Yeah.
so there is a stick out there called a Biltmore stick where you can do that and you can measure straight across. But with these small trees, usually they'll use a little clamp measurer. It just like clamps down on the outside edges of the tree, the micrometer, but a little bit bigger. And that's usually how they measure them in a nursery environment.
Got it. Got it. Okay. Well, thank you for that. It's a good lesson, even for me. I'm not as familiar with those forestry terms as Karen is, so she likes to stop me when I get too much in the jargon. And this time, it felt pretty good to throw it right back at her.
Okay, I gotcha. I gotcha. All right. Just to throw back to the something you had said earlier about minimum root ball diameter, there is a great publication from Ed Gilman, who was a University of Florida extension specialist, and he has a ton of great publications. There's one called Selecting Quality Trees from the Nursery, and he does have some great references for you to go through when you're looking at your tree, including minimum root ball diameters for the tree height and the caliper. So it's a really great publication. Again, Ed Gilman is one of those people that everybody in the industry knows. I mean, he's just got a lot of great work out there, and his stuff is still posted with the University of Florida. He's emeritus now, so he's kind of retired, but still loves talking about trees. So it's an infection, I think.
All right. So Karen, let's say I'm buying some trees now, and I
Okay.
got and I'm looking at a catalog, or I'm at the nursery, and I have two options here. I can either get containerized, or I can get bare root. Like, what does that mean?
Okay, so containerized means that it has been grown in a pot, right? So that there is an artificial soil, like a potting soil that's super fluffy, and they're in the pot and they're irrigated. So they may have been grown out in a field and then put in a pot, or they may have been started from seed in the pot. We don't know. And so that's one of the things that you need to look at when you're looking at potted trees. Another thing to consider is you want to wiggle that tree around in the pot. And if it's super loose, then you want to move on down the road and try to find another one. It should be fairly tight in the pot, but also try to pull that pot off and look at the roots. If the roots are seriously circled around, if any of you have had a potted plant in the house, those roots can get really tight in there and almost form a basket. If you see that on a tree, that again, you're going to have to prune off so many of those roots that the tree is really going to be stressed when you put it in the ground. So you don't want that either.
And this is where, if you have a tree that has outgrown its pot, you're going to see a lot more of those thick roots really just starting to encircle the pot more than a smaller tree that hasn't had that chance yet. So just understand that. And then when you get those girdling roots, or those roots that just keep encircling the outside of a container, one, that's going to inhibit the growth, and two, that's going to end up killing a tree down the road, when that's when you want to enjoy it. You don't really get too much joy out of a tree you just planted. The joy comes years down the road when it does well. Basically, a correlation between growing a tree in a pot too long and the potential for girdling roots.
Right. Yeah. So you definitely want to look at the root health of those trees. They need to be tight in the pot, but they also need to not have a bunch of you're going to get one or two. There's no way you can avoid that. They're actually starting to use more fabric pots that allow air pruning. So the root will grow out, hit the air, and they'll just stop. They'll cut themselves off there. And so that actually seems to be a little bit more helpful to getting a good quality root system. So if you can find a tree that was grown in a fabric container in the ground, usually you're going to get a good root ball with that. The great things about containerized trees is they're easy. You can pick them up because they're fairly light because that artificial soil, but you do have to check that root system, and you probably will have to stake it because that root system is fairly loose in that loose, fluffy soil. So it's going to need a little bit of help to get established. And I'm typically not a big fan of staking because I've seen it done wrong too many times. And I'd rather see a tree not staked than staked wrong because you can girdle your tree by your stake. Typically, those containerized trees are going to have a stick in them where it's taped to the tree with some landscaping tape and it's super stretchy. But let me tell you, your tree will get girdled by that landscaping tape. So please take that stake from the nursery out of the pot before you even put it in the ground. I have seen too many trees die because no one takes that stake off. And then, sometimes I sneak onto people's property and cut it when they're not looking. But people typically frown on that. So,
And honestly, like when I stake things, I try not to tie things to stakes. Like I just kind of put the stake in a supportive fashion where it just kind of leans against it.
well, you want to have for a tree, you want to have more of a guy line than a stake. So think of a tent. When you're putting your tent up, you have a line that's moving out from your tent at an angle. And that's what you want to have for your tree. You don't want it, you want the stakes that are giving it support to be outside of that root ball in the solid ground around it. You don't want to put something in that root ball because it's not going to give you any additional support. You really need to get outside it. And when you're looking at bare root trees, those are the lightest trees of all. And typically you can only find the little tiny ones. Like a lot of times you get bare roots with orchard starts or forestry planting. But more and more, you can find shade trees that are of a good size that have been raised to be bare root trees, and they raise them in these really cool hydroponic systems, and they have beautiful thick full root systems. So if you can find a larger sized bare root tree, then you're almost guaranteed to have a really good root system. But the trick with bare roots is you have to get them in the ground quickly. If those roots dry out because it's a really windy day, then that tree isn't going to survive. You cannot allow the roots to dry out. Most of them will come with a gel coating on them to help prevent the roots from drying out. But it's not like a containerized tree where you can buy it on Monday and plant it a month from now. If you get it on Monday, you should have it in the ground in the next couple of days, if not the same day you get it. It's really important to make sure that you're keeping it cool and in the dark until you're planting it. So stick it in your garage. Make sure you keep those roots wrapped. But you also don't want to just stick it in a bucket of water because roots need air, right? And if you stick it in a bucket of water, you're just drowning the roots, which is going to kill off the roots anyway. So you should only soak your roots right before planting, no more than an hour or two before you're going to put it in the ground.
And Karen, would the month of March in our area be a good time to plant trees?
Yeah, definitely. It's a great time to plant trees, especially if you can get some dormant trees that are bare root. It's a great time to get them in the ground. Once they've started their sap flow and started breaking bud, and you can use the phenology calendar that we talked about on the last show with your growing degree days to determine how late is too late to start planting that specific tree that you want to plant. Because once that sap flow has begun and those buds are starting to break, then you need to put it on hold, because once that happens, those buds are super delicate and easily broken off, and you can really damage your tree. So, right at that early springtime when everything's just getting started, you have little baby buds that are starting to burst, that's a bad time to plant. But if the tree is still dormant, and they should be dormant for most trees for another month or so, but like those maples that are the first ones to bloom, yeah, now's not a good time to plant a maple, one of those soft maples.
So if your eyes are itchy and your nose is running, it's past the maple window. And I'm talking from experience.
Yeah, I mean, because you want to plant in this early spring, you want to plant those dormant trees. When you're looking to summertime's a fine time to plant a tree too if you're going to water it. if that's like the number one pet peeve of mine is people go through all of this effort to pick the perfect tree. They buy the perfect tree, they plant it perfectly, and then they walk away and they don't water it. Like, what plant can you grow without water? Unless it's raining like once a week, you still got to water this poor little thing.
Yeah, and when you're removing a plant from a container and then moving it, there's a lot of fine roots, and the fine roots do a lot of water absorption, and those root hairs and those fine roots all get lost.
Hmm.
Basically, the ability of the plant to take up water is very diminished. So you need to give it more water than most other plants around it. So you can't be basing your watering on the healthy plants that have been there for years. But you have to understand that that new plant that you just transplanted can intake the amount of water that the other plants can intake. So they're going to need a little bit more love.
That's right. And remember, just like any young thing, any child, any baby, you've got to give it extra care. There's a reason we have the term babying. They need extra care. And you have to treat them like a child. You can't treat them like an adult that's fully responsible and able to do things on their own, because they absolutely can't. Even teenage trees need guidance. You've got to prune them to get the right shape, and you still got to take care of them,
And we were doing so well. No, point taken, Karen. Point taken.
So if you all have any questions about planting trees, do check out the West Virginia Tree Minders program. It is online through West Virginia State University, and there's some really great presentations about site selection and planting and tree selection. Great program. Again, it's West Virginia Tree Minders, or WV Tree Minders. Check it out, and if you have any other questions, of course, reach out to your local extension office. Hey friends, we need your help. In order to help keep this show going, we need to hear back from you. Please take some time and check out our evaluation. You can either contact us directly for a copy, or you can go online to https://bit.ly/ here's the tricky part. Capitalize the next 3 words. Extension, calling, evaluation. Again, extension, calling, and evaluation all need to be capitalized. So bit.ly/extension, calling, evaluation. Give us your thoughts. Let us know if you like the show, and especially let us know if you've used any of the information you've gained from our show. Once again, you can reach us directly. You can call Karen at 304-234-3673. That's 304-234-3673. Or you can reach Dan at 740-695-1455. That's 740-695-1455. Let us know how you use the information that you get from this show, whether it is change in your shopping habits, a change in your gardening, or simply just expanding your mind. We want to know. Thank you so much for your time. Thanks for listening to Extension Calling. This show is a collaboration between OSU Belmont County Extension Educator Dan Lima and WVU Ohio County Extension Agent Karen Cox. If you'd like a transcript of this show, contact us at the office. Also, let us know if you enjoy the show by ranking us on your podcast app.